to a Kawasaki KE 175. I'm going to tear into the top end. I'm going to go through and test the charging system on here. Going to do the clutches, remove those, and show you how to go through those, and as well as split the case, get into that crank shaft assembly there and that transmission, show you how the shift mechanism works. So first thing we're going to do is pull the cylinder head off here and the cylinder jug. We've got the reed valve here with the cage in here. This is the intake boot, and then I'll show you those pedals there. We have got a 12 millimeter head bolts around this cylinder head here. We've got 4 cylinder head bolts, and this head is just going to pop right off then. What you don't want to do is get a crowbar underneath here or pry bar and peel this head off. Very, very easily break these fins doing that. So all you simply need to do is get your hands underneath there, go ahead and lift that up. These are removable. They're little rubber plugs here that'll actually help spread these fins out, keep them from bending if they get hit for some reason or dinged up from the side. That's what these rubber dampers are in here for. We'll set that aside. Obviously, well, I'll show you what the top looks like there. There's your dome. You can see there at one time, and most of them are like this where they've been dinged up a little bit by a piston or particles in there. This one's cleaned up very, very nicely, but you can see those little divots there. Obviously, your spark plug through that center hole there. This is what you call the head gasket here, and it is a gasket, a fairly thick gasket that should be removed and replaced every time you tear into this cylinder head. When you torque those cylinder head bolts down, you actually are smashing this gasket. That's why you want to do it in a cross pattern, but you want to smash that gasket evenly. Make sure that all of them are torqued down the exact same, and then once they're smashed down, obviously you replace it the next time because you can't smash it down and seal it up just like that again. So set that aside. We're going to go now and pull our cylinder head bolts off. 12 millimeter on there, all 4 of those. And then before we remove that, I'm going to show you what this reed valve assembly looks like here. Those are 10 millimeters. And you typically have an oil line coming up into here, coming from your oil pump over here. You can see that oil line through that boot there. You flip it on this side, same thing. This oil line goes into that boot there. I'm going to set that aside. Then we've got our reed valve here with our pedals here. And this is called a cage, your reed cage, your reed valve there. These open and shut depending on the airflow, the amount of back pressure that you have there. So setting that aside, we're now ready to pull this cylinder off. Cylinder's off there. Check that cylinder wall. Make sure there's no boring or major wear or tear on there. You also want to check it for being in the round position. You don't want it oval there. You want to make sure that those are in good condition. You can re-sleeve these, you can bore these out, or you can just buy a completely different cylinder. So set that aside. Here's our head bolts. You've got a cylinder base gasket here. Again, you want to make sure that that gets replaced every time. You want to make sure this is cleaned up. Take a razor blade, scrape that off of there. To remove the piston there, you grab your pick there, get it underneath of there, and pry this out. I like to keep my finger on top of it just so it doesn't go flying across the room. Take then from the other side and push this pin out. Okay, and then once you get that piston pin completely pulled out, or pulled out that far at least, you can lift that piston pin up. You will have your wrist pin in there, your bearing here. A lot of times when you order a piston kit, a lot of times this bearing will come along with this pin here. That's if you order an aftermarket piston. If you order a stock piston, you'll have to order all of those pieces separately. So make sure that that gets replaced. They're very, very inexpensive, and they're a common wear problem. Just thing to get replaced every time for the price there. So set that aside. Now we've got our crankshaft here. You can see that it moves freely there. Make sure it doesn't catch. Make sure there's no up and down play or side to side. And once you get that checked out, obviously make sure there's no grooving in here. You want to make sure that all those are working properly. We're actually going to flip this motor up now and tear into this charging system. All right, to tear into the charging system on this Kawasaki KE 100, we've got our side cover here. This is the left-hand side. We've got our countershaft sprocket here. This goes to our rear wheel. This is where our chain goes around here. We've got a front sprocket on there. Typically, we've got that removed. I've showed you a video on how to do that, how to replace that. We had somebody here that had welded this gear shifter on. We have cut that weld. We're going to have to pull this shaft off of here. Obviously, the shifter and the shaft are toast. We're going to get those replaced. We've got a seal in here. This is a fairly common problem because the amount of dirt and debris that gets plowed up in here because of the chain wrapping around here. A lot of times these seals here will need replaced. The nice thing is you can do that when this motor is still in the motorcycle. You don't have to remove it out of the frame to replace that. What you do, take something to remove that seal out. Take the new one, put a little grease around the outside, slide that into position there. Make sure it slides in evenly so you're not getting that seal cockeyed there. And then it needs to be flush with this case here because there's actually going to be a spacer here with your sprocket that's going to slide on there. So that's that. We've got a chain cover that would typically sit here. We've got a sensor here, and I'll tear into that as well while we're doing this. So for now, we're going to lift this gear shifter off. You have splines underneath there. Typically, you'd have a 10mm bolt that runs up from the bottom there and threads into the top part of the gear shifter there. Obviously, this is going to be thrown. And then we've got 2, 4, 6 bolts to remove this left-hand stator cover there. And then underneath your stator cover, we've got your flywheel. Now, this flywheel here, it looks like somebody's been into it once before, so we're going to do our best to take care of this flywheel. They are expensive, they are fragile. You do need special tools to remove this. So we've got a 7/8 nut, regular thread there. Go ahead and pull that off. We've got a lock washer on there, and then underneath the lock washer we have a regular washer. We've got our special tool here now, and I've got these available for sale if you need them. I'll put a link in the description below. You will need a tool like this to remove this flywheel here. So run these bolts in. They're actually, I would not suggest doing this, but they are the same size as your head bolts. So I guess if you're ordering new parts, you want to use these bolts to run into your flywheel to do this trick. You can, but you will need this tool as well. So run these bolts in, snug them up. You want to run them in about 1/2 inch at least to get that good enough grip on there so you're not pulling things apart when you go to remove this flywheel. Okay, we've got our puller installed here. We are going to put some pressure on this bolt here. It's going to push against that crank. It's going to pull that flywheel up. Again, just to kind of go over things here, you want to make sure that your bolts here go into your flywheel about 1/2 inch. You want to make sure that your puller is on there straight. So our shaft here is going to be straight every direction so that when you push this bolt in there, when you turn that in, it's going to push straight onto that crankshaft. It's going to pull that flywheel straight off there. So our puller here, again, I do sell these on my store. Check those out, or I'll put a link below. But you do need specific bolts that a lot of times don't come in the kits that you get from your auto body store. So I'll make sure that the kit that I put a link to has the exact bolts that you need. Run this 19mm in here, and what that's going to do is pull against that flywheel here. It's going to pull that flywheel out. So now I have already pulled this flywheel just to speed things up for you, but I see our issue here is going to be our magnets or weights is what some people call them. These are glued on, and they're glued on in a certain area, a certain pattern. You want to make sure that if you're going back together, make sure you get those exactly like your manual tells you to do, and you want to make sure you position those evenly there. The other thing I want to note here, that if we were to run these bolts too far in, you would actually run those bolts so far in that you hit your stator assembly there. So you want to make sure that you don't do that. We'll set that aside now. We can take our puller off of there. We're actually finished with this puller here. We're finished pulling that flywheel. We'll get into that charging system now. All right, now that we have the flywheel off, we can see our stator here. This is our stator impulsor. Some people call them a generator or an alternator. Magneto, there's a handful of different names for them. What this does is create the energy and the power, actually creates a spark so that your motorcycle can run. So without this, you will not have spark on your motorcycle. Now, the issue with this is it probably started up and ran, probably didn't run great, but a lot of times these magnets, just a handful of them are stuck. Maybe there's just a handful of them that are broke off, and it's still creating some spark, just not enough spark to keep that motorcycle running, or it just won't start at all, just have some weak spark because of the gaps in between here. So it's not creating a steady enough flow of power to get that motorcycle started. So the other thing that you can do on these, and I've loosened up a couple of these screws here, are you can advance and retard this. So you can see there's a little bit of a slot here underneath this screw and this screw here. You can take and shift that a little bit to advance it if it needs to. So we've got 2 screws that hold this stator, this plate on here, and this entire plate will come out of here. Now that I have those screws off of there, you can see there's some wiggle room in each of those spots there. So the other thing, you've got a wire going to your sensor here. You'll have to undo that small Phillips screw. We won't take that off all the way. Take and slide that out. Now we can take and make sure that we pull up this grommet as well so that isn't sticking into place there. Now going back together, you want to make sure that this seats properly, seals up like it should. A lot of times people will put a little bit of liquid gasket maker around that edge there just to make sure that it seals up properly. So that's the stator plate there. The stator assembly is this entire assembly. Now, if you were to go and order this from Kawasaki, most of the time they would sell it a plate, this piece and this piece separately. So it'd be 3 separate pieces here. Sometimes you can buy it as a set. If you buy them aftermarket, a lot of times they come with a set. Just check out my videos on buying some of these aftermarket parts and some of these knockoff parts. So check those out. Make sure you're buying high quality stuff there. Underneath of the stator assembly, we've got a Woodruff key that's here. It's a little keeper. It's a little half moon shape. That goes into your crankshaft. That's also going to go into your flywheel there. Keep that flywheel from turning. Otherwise, if you forget to put that in there, or it doesn't get put in there properly, or it breaks off, sometimes they break off, that flywheel is going to spin with your crankshaft. You can see there our crankshaft is tapered there. So if that loosens up and that keeper comes out of there, that flywheel can just loosen up and spin on there. There's nothing else that holds that from spinning. So that bolt that tightens this down is only going to do so much work there with the amount of times that this is spinning and the force that it has. To remove this sensor here, we've got 2 more screws that we need to remove. And this is going to fit right over top of your shift drum. So when we split this crankcase, you'll see our shift drum is right in behind there. You've got a little pin there. At some point that'll stop spinning. You can get to your P3 is my impact here, and then slide that on there. That's the correct size for this. Take a hammer, loosen this up. Now you do want to make sure that you spin it all the way till it stops. Otherwise, when you take and slam on it just like that, it's going to spin into place. You could potentially break some of those shift forks. So take and spin that off. I'm going to keep all of this together. You can see there we've got a sensor lead there. This is kind of, we'll go around here, and that is part of the sensor there. So you want to make sure that that stays into place. You also have a little tab there that's going to fit into that hole there on that shift assembly. So I went ahead and pulled a handful of these Phillips screws out already just to speed this process up. These are sometimes a challenge. These are a GIS screw, so they don't use your typical Phillips screwdriver, and sometimes they work themselves off when you are trying to pull these off because they are a lot of times very, very old. So like I said, what I use there is a impact driver here. This is the Matco. I'll put a link below for this. It is a very, very handy tool when it comes to removing these screws because, like I said, they have a tendency of not coming out like they should. Once you get them all loosened up, then I go around and use that same bit there, put it in my impact and unscrew all these. Just speeds things up a little bit. 4 of them behind the stator assembly. Okay, we got all 4 of those out. I'm gonna flip this over now and get into the clutch side, and I'm gonna go through that process with you. This is the Kawasaki KE 175 charging system, countershaft sprocket, our shift sensor there. I'm gonna flip this over and we're gonna get into the clutch assembly here. Stand this on end. This motor here is out of a Kawasaki KE 175. We've got our oil pump underneath this cover here. We've got our clutches underneath here. We've got our Kickstarter gear here. You can see it's written there. Here's our sight glass for our engine oil, and here's our fill cap here. It also tells you the amount of oil that it holds, 0.7 liters. So not even 3/4 of a quart of oil is what this is going to take. We're going to go through, we're going to loosen up all of these screws around the outside here, these bolts, and they are a larger Phillips screw. A GIS is what they are officially called, and they take a very, very large screwdriver. Okay, we've got all those bolts out of there. We're going to go ahead and remove them at this time. I've got the 2 bolts off of the oil pump cover here. We're going to remove that. That's all it takes to remove that. You can see there we've got our cable that's going to run down here. It's going to fit into this butterfly. The cable is going to run down there. We've got a couple oil lines that are going to run through there, through these ports up top here. So make sure that you remove those hoses if they have not been removed already, so that you can pull this oil pump off of here. A lot of times if people put on their the block off kit, basically so they can pre-mix their oil as opposed to relying on this oil pump, then a lot of times those hoses are going to be removed already. If that's the case, you do want to block off these ports here so that your dirt and debris isn't getting down into this oil pump housing cover here. And then we've got the screw to remove there. We can pull this oil pump off. Now you can see there that oil pump, if either one of these tabs breaks off, it's going to create quite an issue there. Underneath of this area here is an O-ring. There's also one that sits right in there. That's got a little rubber O-ring that seals that up. Those need to be in good working condition. You want to make sure that you get those replaced if you're tearing into this bottom end here. We've got one more bolt here we're going to remove, and our clutch cover is going to be ready to come off of there. We've got an arm right here. A lot of times you're going to take and actually turn this arm that's up top here, and a lot of times that'll lift that up. That'll break that gasket free. So we're able to do that and pull up on this clutch cover here. You've got your Kickstarter seal here that a lot of times will kind of hold you up, so you wiggle that, should be able to pull you right out of there. So there is underneath of our clutch cover there. There's our sight glass window, the back side of it. Here is your release arm or your push rod for your clutch, so that'll engage and disengage your clutch. So when you pull that clutch lever on the left-hand side there up by your handlebars, that's going to push your lever that way, which will be forward, and that is going to push your arm out. That's going to disengage your clutch. So if this is not adjusted properly, you will have some issues there. So you've got some adjustment on your clutch there, that if it's not disengaging all the way, then you're going to back that off, so that when you let off of the clutch lever up at the handlebars, there's going to be more pressure on your plates down here. Now if you turn that the other direction and engage your clutch quicker, you're going to actually pull that lever this way. That's actually going to push in on the plate here, and that's going to disengage your clutches quicker. Or if you adjust it too far, it's going to leave a gap in between these friction plates here, the friction in the steel, and your clutch is not going to be engaging all the way when you are running. So you want to make sure you get that adjusted properly there. That's kind of the explanation on the clutch system. If you've got more questions on that, make sure and leave those comments below, but hope that was helpful there. Kickstarter gear here, we're going to actually have to remove our shift linkage here to remove that Kickstarter gear. So we have 6 8mm bolts here, 2, 4, 6. We're going to go ahead and remove those at this time. You got to make sure you do these in a cross pattern. So go to the other side then, loosen that completely up, because these are all putting pressure on one plate there. If you go and just do one all of the way, then there's going to be quite a bit of pressure on the other bolts there. So you want to make sure that those come out slowly so that you're not putting all the pressure on one bolt. So remove that. We've got a bolt underneath of there. That is not the stock bolt. This one takes a 17 millimeter to remove. Go ahead and remove that. Now what we're going to be able to do is pull this entire clutch pack off as all one unit. Now I'm going to set that down here because what I'm going to do is take and put this plate back on here, and then I'm going to tighten up these 8 millimeter bolts so that we can keep that entire plate assembly together. Okay, once we get those bolts snugged up, now what we can do is take and remove our plate just like that. That's all our plates, steel and friction, held together there by our two inner and outer plates there. So you can take that out, inspect your clutch basket, make sure there's no major grooving. A lot of times what will happen here on these old clutch baskets is they'll get grooves in here from these plates wearing in there and constant pressure. A lot of times you get some major grooves in there. So you want to make sure that those are in good condition before you go back together. We can just take, and just to kind of put everything together, or keep everything together, just slide those plates and stuff back on there. Let's set that aside while we dig further into this transmission assembly here. We've got our shift arm that runs through this point here. We can pull up on this lever, that's your shift drum. And we can take this lever and pull up on it. It goes all the way through. That goes to the left-hand side of your motorcycle where your shifter is. So that's the shifter there. Again, that piece needs completely replaced there because it was welded on. So we'll set that in the trash. This gear goes behind the clutch pack, and it'll actually sit in two grooves that are underneath of the clutch basket. So these grooves will fit down in there. And there's a bushing that goes right on there. That slides right onto that shaft there. And I'll show you that shaft when we get into that transmission a little bit farther. So Kickstarter gear, it's time for that. That is here. You've got a spring on there. Be really careful when you're taking that apart. What I do is very, very carefully, I'll grab a pair of pliers with some good teeth on there, and I like to take the pressure off of this Kickstarter gear. A lot of times that'll make it that much easier to pull up and out. But once you get it past the grooves there, you can let go of that. And then also what I'll do is take and I'll pull that spring out of there so we're not being held up by that spring. All right, once we get that spring off there, you can take and just lift up on that Kickstarter gear there. We've got a spring in behind here. Make sure you keep track of that. You've got your ratchet assembly here on this gear. You can see that I can spin it one direction, but not the other. So when you go to engage your Kickstarter there, what you're doing is engaging it this way. It engages that motor, engages that clutch, engages that crankshaft, and then when you let off of that, it's going to spring back, and it's going to allow just to be freewheeling in there. So that's why you've got to have such a heavy-duty spring up here, is because you want that to flip back so that that disengages immediately. Otherwise, you're going to sit there and that gear is going to be grinding on this arm here. So a lot of times, if you hold your Kickstarter down, you'll hear a noise that's similar to this, but it's just constant. It's because you're not fully disengaged there from this ratchet gear on the back. So you want to make sure after you start your motorcycle, let off of that kick lever. Otherwise, you're just wearing those teeth down on that ratchet assembly. So that's the Kickstarter gear there. Okay, we've got our shift drum ready to come out of here, or at least take this plate off of there, and then we've got a spring-loaded arm that engages that shift drum there. We've got a circlip here, a snap ring that we need to pull off, and then our Kickstarter gear has the disengaging arm as well. So we've got two bolts that we need to remove there, and that is off. Now we have this plate that I'm going to remove, as well as this arm. That's a specialty bolt there, so make sure you keep that together. That kind of holds that arm together. Also keep that spring with it. You can see our shift drum is here. This plate will pull off. We'll set that aside. This side looks like that. You've got an arm or a peg that goes down into that hole there. This nut is ready to come off of here, and we've got a couple other bolts that we need to get removed, and then we will be ready to split this case. I'm going to hang on to the crank while I remove this. It's 1 1/16". Pull that nut there. Then we can just take and slide this gear off. We've got a plate here going back together. You want to make sure you bend the tab down on this nut so that that nut doesn't turn itself off. You've got a keeper in behind this gear that'll keep that gear from spinning. This is the crankshaft here. So we'll set that aside. Okay, now we've got all these bolts out. We've got a gear right here. Pull the snap ring. That gear will slide off of there. Now, one thing to note here, we've got our gear that has a chip out, a tooth is out. That gear is going to idle. So this is called an idler gear, which means it doesn't actually engage onto the shaft that's behind it. This works as a idler gear. It goes between the Kickstarter gear that is over here, and it also goes to the clutch assembly that is here, sits onto that gear that is on here. So all that working together. Now, if we've got a chipped tooth on this gear, at some point it's going to disengage from your clutch gear, this one here, or it's going to disengage from your Kickstarter gear over here. So you want to make sure that you get this gear replaced so that all those gears are touching like they should. Push these aside, and we are going to split this case. Double check there's no more bolts around this crankcase. Flip it over, do the same thing over here. Double check there's no more. Then you can grab a rubber mallet. I do see one down in there. So I think I told you we had 4 underneath our stator. We do have another one over here. Okay, once we get these out, now these are going to be a challenge because you can't get my impact driver down in here on a couple of these. So I've showed you how to remove these bolts in a separate video. Go check that out. You'll find it very helpful to get some of these bolts down here. Okay, we've got all the bolts out that are around the outside of this crankcase. Now what we're going to do is grab a rubber mallet, and I'm going to turn this case sideways to start. So set it on its side there. You can take and tap a couple different places there to start splitting that crankcase apart there. There's going to be sort of a seal from a liquid gasket that goes in between these cases, and also the bearings and the seals that are on the outside are going to hold this case together. So a lot of times it takes a little bit of persuading to get this crankcase apart. As soon as you do start to split it, you'll have some oil that was down in the bottom end that's going to start coming out. And then when you start tapping on either side there, you'll end up figuring out which side of the case is going to keep all the gears in it. So it looks like all those gears are going to stay on this side of the crankcase. So we'll tap a little bit more to keep splitting that crankcase apart. When you feel like it's going to just pop off of there, we'll set it on its side there and get your fingers in between the crankcases and just pull up on the transmission here. And we can just kind of walk that out. Now we've got the crankcases split at this time. All of our gears, washers, everything are going to stay on one side typically when you do start with it on the end there. So as soon as we get that pulled, we can start pulling our transmission apart. We can also take and pull that crankshaft apart there. So to pull the shift forks and the shift shaft out, I like to just pry up about 1/4 inch there, and then you can take and spin those shift forks around until you can pull them out. There's a set of shift forks there. We've got another single shift fork over here that are going to be behind these transmission gears. So we can take, and then I like to keep these together, and the shift fork's going to come up with it at the same time. And then you want to pay attention that when you're doing this, a lot of times you'll have a washer or a gear in this case stay on this side of the crankcase there. So you want to put that right back to where it was so that you know, going back together, how those gears line up. So we had a gear and a washer that stayed in place there. I'm going to slide that on that shaft. We've got our shift drum that we can walk out just like that. You've got the shift drum that's actually going to sit right on the crankcase on the other side. So you want to make sure that that's got a good surface on there. Make sure there's no chunks of metal or anything that are wearing in that area. Now to get the crankshaft out, just flip it on the other side there. You can take a rubber mallet, tap on the crankshaft going out this direction, and that crankshaft should just pop right out. That is a crankcase split on a 1980 Kawasaki KE 175. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure and leave those below. If this video has been helpful, make sure you subscribe, like, and share. Thanks for watching.